Good afternoon. Thank you for joining us. My name is Andrew Schumann. I am one of the co-chiefs of the Clinical Ethics Service, and on behalf of the Center for Bioethics and Social Sciences and Medicine, it's our privilege to welcome you to Bioethics Grand Rounds. We really have a treat today, and one of the things that we try to do with Bioethics Grand Rounds is really take advantage of the breadth and depth of the university broadly, more so than just the medical campus, and today is a perfect example of that. We are honored to have Professor McQuade with us, who is a professor in the law school. She's been with us since 2017 and teaches and has interest in the area of national security, criminal law, and criminal procedure, and has an incredibly broad and impressive background, which I'll summarize briefly just so she has enough time to speak, because otherwise I'll go on for too long. Professor McQuade was the first woman to serve as the U.S. Attorney for the Eastern District of Michigan, appointed in 2010 by President Obama. And she oversaw a number of cases over the course of her tenure there, which made national news and really changed the legal landscape in many ways, involving public corruption, terrorism, corporate fraud, trade secrets, healthcare fraud, and others. Some of the specific cases and areas in which she was working involved the conviction of former Mayor Kilpatrick in Detroit, the case involving the Al-Qaeda operative with attempted bombing in 2009 in Detroit, as well as the case involving emissions with Volkswagen. She also served as the vice chair of the U.S. Attorney General's advisory committee under Attorney General Lynch, and co-chair of the Terrorism and National Security Subcommittee during her tenure with the federal government. Before becoming U.S. Attorney, she served as an assistant U.S. Attorney in Detroit for a number of years and Deputy Chief of National Security through that office. She practiced law in a firm in Detroit through the 1990s. And she is a native Michigander, as well as an alum of University of Michigan, having graduated undergraduate here and then from our law school. She's also a national presence in terms of popular media and news, and can be seen on a number of popular shows that are nationally syndicated and broadcast, as well as having a number of fancy awards, of which I'll only summarize 2 or 3, again, in the interest of time. She was the Michiganian of the Year through the Detroit News, Crane Detroit Business, Detroit's Most Influential Woman, as well as multiple honors from the Detroit NAACP, Arab American Civil Rights League, and many others. So without further ado, it's truly my privilege and pleasure to introduce us to Professor McQuade, and we should have time, hopefully, for some interactive questions at the end. And full disclosure, she is a law professor, so she might call on you. Be careful. Thank you so much.
Well, good afternoon. Thanks so much. Can everybody hear me okay? Great. Well, thank you very much for the nice introduction. I want to thank Ed Goldman and Amy Lynn for inviting me to be here today. I have fond memories of this place. All 4 of my children were born here. We've, after that, made many visits to the emergency room, nothing terribly serious, I'm glad to say. But it's nice to be here on a day when neither I nor any of my family members are ill, and just here to enjoy your company. So I'm sure all of you in the medical profession and here at the hospital know far more than I do about some of the medical implications of opioids, but I thought I would share with you some of the law enforcement perspectives on the problem in hopes that we might further enlighten each other. And I'll try to save some time at the end for questions or comments, because I'd love an opportunity to learn from you as well. And this does happen to be Opioid Awareness Week in Michigan, so we are timely with this presentation, and I know Michigan has announced a number of new things as a result of this, and has been working pretty hard in this area, including the launch of a new website at michigan.gov/opioids. Am I okay? Oh, what do I need to do to turn it back on? Oh. Let me go grab it.
Nothing that you.
Oh. Okay. All right. Well, that's all right. We will talk a little bit before that. In my work, as you heard, at the U.S. Attorney's Office, one of our priorities was healthcare fraud, and we saw a great. Hello, Mike. we saw a great connection between healthcare fraud and opioid distribution on the streets. And so I'll talk about that a little bit as well. Some of the things I thought I would talk about today are some background on the problem that you no doubt know all about, the role of the medical profession in contributing to that problem. And then I want to talk about some changes in the law that we've seen that are some welcome changes to help address some of these things. And yet some challenges remain, and I'll talk a little bit about how the medical profession can contribute to helping. And I think it's sometimes helpful to think about the problem from not only the supply side, which we tend to focus a lot on, at least in law enforcement, in doing back-end enforcement, but in also thinking about the demand side. Why do people want these drugs in the first place? And I think that's where all of you can come in addressing the issue. So first, some background and some statistics. I have a slide on this. Instead, I will tell you about it. As I'm sure you know that since 1999, opioid deaths in Michigan have multiplied by a factor of 17, from 99 in 1999 to 1,700 in the last year for which it was recorded. Last year, we had even more opioid deaths, almost 2,400, even more dying from opioid overdoses than from car accidents. And then in 2017, another 12% increase in that number. So the number continues to rise. One of the things that I'm sure you know about, but we see in law enforcement with response to overdose victims on the street, is many people overdosing on heroin that is laced with fentanyl. Fentanyl is something that street dealers are using. It can be imported through the mail from China and other foreign countries. And of course, as you know, fentanyl is this incredibly potent drug. It is 100 times, or it's 50 times more potent than heroin, and you never know how much percentage of fentanyl you may be getting in your heroin. And so very often, people who are using heroin because it's so much cheaper than the pills to which they become addicted, that it results in an overdose death. The other trend that we're seeing on the streets is not only using fentanyl, but using carfentanil, this animal tranquilizer, which is 100 times stronger than fentanyl. And so incredibly powerful. People who are addicts actually welcome the idea that they might be able to use drugs that are so incredibly potent. But one thing that statistics show us is, as far as the data can be determined, 80% of people who are using heroin began with prescription pills. So those pills came from somewhere, from some sort of prescription, from some sort of doc, from some sort of medical clinic, from some sort of hospital. And so that's where the medical profession does have a role to play in all of this. And then, of course, the cost of opioids. I think you as healthcare professionals see the healthcare costs of it, but the incredible cost to society. It has been estimated that the cost of opioid addiction is $1 trillion since 2001. And that, of course, includes emergency response and healthcare, but also the criminal justice system. This drives so much crime in the criminal justice system. All kinds of theft, all kinds of driving incidents, the cost of rehabilitation, the cost of lost productivity. And it's not just users, but of course their family members. No doubt there is someone you know and someone you work with who has a family member struggling with some sort of opioid addiction. And it doesn't just affect the person who's dealing with the addiction, but those family members in our workforce who are missing work and who are distracted at work because of this burden that they're dealing with. We know that some users leave the workforce altogether, and so we're missing out on that work. And that abuse is generating crime because people are desperate for cash, home invasions, break-ins at pharmacies, all kinds of crimes that are caused. So let me talk now a little bit about the role of the medical profession in the opioid crisis. And this is where the medical profession is contributing as drivers of the supply to the problem. One, overprescribing. I think this was a very significant problem and may still be a problem to some extent, but I think we've done a really good job in working on this issue. A lot of attention to this issue, a lot of healthcare providers paying close attention to this issue, and I would say this is no longer the most significant driver of what is causing the supply of illicit opioids in our streets. I think instead what the greatest driver is Medicare fraud. Real doctors seeing real patients who are using prescriptions as a kickback to those patients who want the drugs. And I'll talk about that in a minute. And then the third driver is poor compliance. So I'll talk about each of those in turn. So you, I'm sure at this, on the front lines of prescribing medicines, are seeing people and you're dealing with acute pain and chronic pain and patients who want and need opioids legitimately. And there was a time in the early days when the pharmaceutical companies were pushing OxyContin and other drugs, doctors were prescribing it, pain was being measured as a vital sign, and the rate of prescriptions went up and up and up and up, so that the United States was using far more opioids than any other country in the world. And then as we saw that these addictions begin with prescription pills and transition to heroin, which goes on to these overdose deaths. But we've got a lot of good laws on the books, which I'll talk about a little bit to address this problem. Some have argued we've even overcorrected on this problem. I don't know what your perspective on that is. But I still see this as not today the biggest problem of the supply side of prescription pills on the street. I think the biggest driver is instead Medicare fraud. This is a huge problem, multi-million-dollar frauds. Prosecutors in my office and agents from DEA, FBI, and Health and Human Services, Office of Inspector General, work on these cases every day and cannot keep up. It's like Lucy and Ethel on the conveyor belt with the chocolates coming through. There are so many cases, they have to pick the highest ones to go after because we lack adequate resources to address all of them. And one of the ways I think that we're finding all of this fraud now is because in only recent years have investigators and prosecutors begun to use data to identify the outliers who are prescribing opioids. And it's been an incredible tool. And what the data shows is that it's actually a very small set of doctors. It is not all of the medical profession to blame for the supply of opiates. It's actually a small set of doctors engaging in fraud who are responsible. And we find a correlation between the highest prescribers of opioids and the highest outliers in other procedures, infusions, injections, nuclear stress tests, electronic stimulation tests, home health care, all kinds of things. The doctors who are the outliers in the highest billers in the state in these other procedures, many of which are very expensive and the reimbursement from Medicare is very high, are also the highest opioid prescribers. And why is that? It's because they're using the opioids as an inducement to patients to come in and either undergo these tests, to undergo nuclear stress tests or injections in exchange for opioids and get the pills that they want and need, or to say that they did. So often it's not just unnecessary tests, medically unnecessary tests, but they may just sign papers saying that they did undergo these tests. The doctor then bills Medicare for these expensive, many thousands of dollars of tests. The patient gets his pills and goes on his way. The doctor gets rich, and taxpayers pay, and society pays as these addictions continue to be fueled. And we have cases every single week involving this kind of fraud all over the Detroit metropolitan area. Just last week, there was a CEO from a medical care organization from West Bloomfield who pleaded guilty to fraud, and he was the last of 12 other defendants, including 7 doctors in that scheme, a number of clinics all around Metro Detroit, and his clinics were providing pills to patients in exchange for undergoing unnecessary tests and injections. He distributed over a 9-year period 6.6 million pills, and their scheme generated $300 million from Medicare. All day, every day. This is such a cost to our system. Think about what we could be doing with that money if we weren't providing fraudulent bills to doctors who are getting rich off of it. And again, it's a very small subset of doctors. And so when people say your overprescribing is the problem, it's really only a tiny fraction of the problem. This is the problem. And I don't know the solution to that problem other than to improve investigations in Medicare. And one of the reasons for it, I have been told, is that Medicare is a pay-first program. We want people who need Medicare coverage to be able to get services performed when they go to see doctors, so that doctors don't refuse their services, so that they get that and the doctor gets paid right away. And it's only after the fact, through audits and investigations, that these schemes get detected. I don't know how many of them go undetected, but I will tell you, we go after the low-hanging fruit because that's the top priority, and we lack the resources to go after all of them. And I say we, meaning speaking on behalf of law enforcement generally, even though I'm only an emeritus when it comes to law enforcement. The other big driver of pills on the street and the supply of illicit medication are these pill mills. These are shops that doctors set up on the street in a house. It might be in a strip mall, in a shopping plaza, and doctors will set up and write prescriptions in exchange for cash. And it goes on all the time, all over our community, including an example right here in Ypsilanti. It was on the border of Ann Arbor and Ypsilanti, where there were doctors who were prescribing opioids. They would charge their patients who would show up and wait in line $250 for a bottle of pills, 30 pills for $250. This group prescribed more than 1.5 million pills over a 4-year period and generated $4.5 million. Some of those people are the end user. Some of those people take those pills and then sell them on the street for about $80 a pill. And if you do the math, if they're getting 30 for $250 and selling for $80 a pill, that can be a lucrative business as well. The key to uncovering these investigations for law enforcement professionals is the data. And I speak to you about this because I know for many years, the medical lobby was very resistant to permitting investigators access to this data. And the fear was that well-intentioned doctors doing the right thing, who happen to be seeing patients who need more of this or more of that, would be falsely accused of crimes. And I will tell you that is far from the case. The outliers that we're looking at are so many times off the charts from what legitimate doctors are doing that no one is going to be falsely accused based on data alone. I will also tell you that a case cannot be made on data alone. Once you get the data, that just begins an investigation. Then it permits scrutiny of the underlying documents. Sometimes undercovers are sent in to try to buy pills and see what kind of examination the doctor is actually giving. In that case in Ypsilanti, the doctor was not giving any examination at all, and patients were coming from as far away as Ohio and throughout the area, driving all the way to Michigan to see this doctor because they knew if you just showed up and paid cash, you could get your bottle of pills. So that data is really only a red flag, and I hope that doctors are no longer resisting the idea that law enforcement investigators need this data if they're going to be able to identify these outlier doctors who are driving this source of supply. And so that is, I hope, an ethical issue that you will agree is important for transparency. And if there are counter arguments, I'd love to hear them during the Q&A. But data is such a valuable tool to help us identify these illicit distributors of drugs that end up on the streets. The third driver of the supply is compliance issues. Compliance is so important, and compliance laws are designed to prevent the diversion of drugs to those who are not authorized to have them or use them, and the theft of drugs. There is the Controlled Substances Act, which I'm sure all of you are either familiar with or learning about, that regulates. It's a highly regulated environment. And there's a separate registration required for each facility that dispenses drugs because it is intended to be so tightly controlled. And the failure of a registrant results in a fine of $25,000 per violation. And so when you find somebody not in compliance, each incident of noncompliance is punishable by $25,000, which can add up in a hurry. And the purpose of those rules is to prevent drugs from ending up in the wrong hands, in the hands of unauthorized dealers, or drug traffickers. One of the things we found is at the U.S. Attorney's Office, we did quite a bit of prosecution of drug trafficking organizations connected to Mexican cartels distributing cocaine, heroin, marijuana, other drugs on the streets. We found that many of these street-level dealers had turned to pills instead of these other kinds of drugs because they were easier to get their hands on, they were incredibly lucrative, and the penalties tended to be much less severe than they were where there are mandatory minimums for drugs like cocaine and heroin and other drugs. And so we saw lots of pill runners. In fact, Michigan was identified as a source for what we referred to as the US 23 pipeline, going from Michigan all the way down to the southern states through Ohio, Kentucky, Tennessee, and then off into Appalachia. Those sources were all coming from Detroit. And so we developed a working group with law enforcement from all of those states to address this pipeline. But Detroit was very much the source of pills that were going down the US 23 corridor to supply these drugs. And part of it comes from compliance issues. And I tell you that because, as I'm sure you know, This university hospital recently entered a settlement with DEA in the largest ever settlement for a compliance issue. This incredibly great institution, this place where all 4 of my children were born, this that we hold out as the greatest university in the world, says James Earl Jones, which I truly believe. I was actually recused from this case, which my office investigated because my husband at the time was working here, and I later, of course, now work here. But just this August, this settlement was reached where this hospital, it was entitled UMHS. We know we've been rebranded as Michigan Medicine, but during the time this began in 2012, it was the University of Michigan Health System, agreed to pay $4.3 million settlement. Those $25,000 violations add up. And so for $4.3 million, the health system agreed to resolve the settlement. Did not admit guilt of any crime or violation, but did agree to pay this to resolve these allegations. And it was prompted, as I'm sure many of you remember, by overdose deaths here at this hospital by a nurse and an anesthesiology resident. The resident overdose did not die, went into cardiac arrest. The nurse died as a result of an overdose here at the hospital, which is actually what prompted the investigation. And so the hospital has entered into a 3-year memorandum of agreement that governs drug handling and audits, and DEA will be in your house for the next 3 years to do these audits. And here are some of the allegations. Failing to secure separate registration for 15 locations. All these facilities like East Ann Arbor Clinic and Briarwood and all these facilities all over the place needed their own registration. Failure. There were narcotics going from this hospital to those locations to be dispensed to patients. Failure to maintain all those records of drugs received and drugs delivered, and actual thefts from these locations were, there's a failure to notify DEA of those thefts and losses, which also had a negative ability to prevent theft and loss. So very serious violations. Now, I will tell you that this university, this hospital, did some very good things when that investigation began to result in only a $4.3 million settlement. $25,000 violations for each incident add up in a hurry. But because of a number of things, remedial things that the hospital did before reaching the settlement, early on, as soon as this was detected, they were able to reach that resolution that was far more favorable than it could have been. So doing many, many of the right things on its own. And you're probably familiar with a lot of these things. A very enhanced system of monitoring distribution now. I know you have tools that you use here to make sure that the distribution of drugs, the chain of custody of those drugs is very carefully monitored. And so kudos to you investigating significant time, technology into that effort made a big difference. Some employees were replaced as a result of this, but lots of programs to educate employees, to review incidents. There's a whistleblower hotline here, raising awareness of opioid abuse, and doing a number of things now to prevent addiction. So lots of remedial efforts done in addition to the compliance agreement that was entered into. So good job. It's a happy ending. And we hope that you'll continue to be a model and be leaders and best around the country in how to comply with drug laws. All right. In Michigan, we've seen some recent changes in the law that have been helpful, I think, that will be helpful to addressing not only the supply, but also somewhat of the demand. One was this Good Samaritan law that was passed in 2015 and then modified in 2016. And the idea behind this law is if you are with a friend who overdoses, we want you to call the police or 911 and say, oh my gosh, I think my friend is overdosing. Get him an ambulance. Because what we saw happening before then was someone saying, oh my gosh, my friend is overdosing, and if I call for help, I'm going to get arrested. I better just run away. And person who may have been able to be revived or helped in some way was left to die. And so to provide an inducement for people to call, this Good Samaritan law was put into place. You won't be in trouble if you call asking for help for your friend, for your loved one. Initially, this was only limited to callers who were under 21. Great idea. The idea was young people might not know what to do if they find themselves in this situation. But as we know, opioids know no age. There's lots of people of every age who may find themselves with someone in an overdose situation. So in 2016, that law was fixed, a good fix in my opinion, to eliminate that age limit. Another law is this change in who can get access to Narcan. And it is now the case, and as I'm sure all of you know, Narcan can be used to revive people who are on the path to an overdose death. Can't return you from the dead. It is not a zombie medicine. It can only revive someone who is breathing has slowed such to the point that they're in danger of death. But in 2016, Michigan passed a law that lets pharmacists dispense naloxone, is the drug name, Narcan, without an individual prescription. You can get it from a pharmacist, so family and friends can now get this drug and have it handy in case they have a family member that they know is struggling with an addiction. One of the things in an area where medical professionals can help, I think, is I have been told that when you use Narcan on a subject and you revive them, they wake up incredibly violent. I don't know why that is, but something about what's going on with their brain. And so I have been told there's a great need by community service organizations who want to carry Narcan. Certainly law enforcement officers now carry it and are able to administer it when they encounter someone, but that there's a great need for training with community groups who want to carry Narcan but don't know how to administer it properly, safely, effectively. And so there may be a role for medical professionals to help with that training. But another positive change in the law, positive changes to MAPS, the Michigan Automated Prescription System, to try to help improve that data. Again, as I said, this is an area where law enforcement investigators can look to identify outliers. And since June, doctors must now consult MAPS before prescribing more than a 3-day supply of opioids. And I think the idea there is to prevent users from doctor shopping. You know, just yesterday you saw a different doctor and you obtained opioids. And so by looking on MAPS and tracking where they have obtained prescriptions, we can prevent them from fooling the system. Some changes to the laws for doctors. Curious to hear how you feel about this, but now doctors have to have a bona fide prescriber-patient relationship to write prescription for opioids. I think this only applies to, well, maybe this is for everybody, acute versus chronic. Maybe that's for everybody. Doctors have to counsel patients about the dangers of opioids to make sure they're obtaining informed consent. For minors, we have to get consent of parents. I remember a time when my son, who was then, I think, 14 years old, broke his ankle skiing, and a doctor prescribed hydrocodone and a prescription for 30 days of pills for a broken ankle. And I think most parents at that time, he's now 19, so 5 years ago, I think most parents would have filled that prescription and said, son, take your pills. The doctor said, take them. And I know you're supposed to take your pills till you're done. So take your pill. I would have been doing that, except for the fact that I'd been exposed to this information. And so we didn't fill it. We just gave him Advil, and I don't think he needed anything more than that. But I'm not even sure he took the Advil. And so, you know, how many patients? So I think this is a really good change in the law. Curious to hear your thoughts about it, but making sure there's a conversation that goes on before you get those pills. And doctors may no longer prescribe more than 7 days of opioids for acute pain. Curious about how you're seeing how chronic pain is being treated. I know this law, when it went on the books, there were op-eds in the newspaper saying this is a really bad idea. Patients who are really in pain aren't going to be able to get it. I think for chronic pain they can, but I wonder how, and I hear anecdotally about people with chronic pain going back to their doctor and continuing to receive opioids for pain, whether they need it or not, resulting in addiction. Some changes to the law in education, and I like this because it addresses not only the supply side, but also the demand side. The Michigan Department of Education has been directed to develop programming for students on preventing opioid abuse. And by the 2019-2020 school year, there will be opioid abuse prevention programs in the school health curriculum. I don't know at what level that will be targeted. The schools are permitted to figure that out. But I like this because it addresses the demand. If we can educate our kids about some of the dangers. I think now you hear these stories about teenagers finding opioids in a medicine cabinet and taking them, thinking, how bad can they be? A doctor prescribed this to my parents for its medicine. How bad can it be? And so perhaps raising the awareness of young people can prevent them from starting down that road in the first place. Some changes in the law about information sharing between federal and state authorities, DEA sharing information with states, states sharing information with DEA. They said that relies on the integrity of that data in MAPS to find those outliers. So that's very important. And some new federal legislation was just passed in October. I think it still awaits the president's signature. I couldn't find any record that he's actually signed it yet, but it is believed that he will, called the Support Act that has a number of different provisions, but I've seen a lot of praise for this because it focuses on treatment and prevention. So again, that demand side, not just addressing the supply side, but some research for treatment alternatives to opioids, which I think is so incredibly important. I'm sure there are many people who are in pain. I'm sure there are many people who deal with depression and mental health and hopelessness and all kinds of other things. And we should be looking to alternatives to opioids for those kinds of things, because I think that's the real driver. But also for treatment, lots of treatment options, including medication-assisted treatment, grants for recovery centers that include housing, and mental and physical health care. So lots of good changes in that new federal legislation. All right, and let me conclude with how medical professionals, like all of you, can help address this problem. In addition to providing Narcan training for community groups, I think one of the things that you can do is figuring out how to deal with people who need treatment for chronic pain, and how you balance that with the risk of addiction. I don't know how you do that. I think these laws are there to address people dealing with acute pain and prescribing and some doctor shopping. But I know anecdotally of people, senior citizens, who use opioids because they've told their doctor they have back pain and they use it every day. And they use it as a crutch in the same way other people use alcohol. And they're older and they're lonely and they're depressed. Are there other things we can be doing for these people to treat them more holistically, to avoid prescribing opioids for them in the first place? And again, looking at the demand and not just the supply, researching alternatives to opioids for managing pain, looking at the demand and not just the supply. Compliance, I think we've had our little talk about this. You folks, I'm sure, have learned very, very well what can happen with compliance problems. Not only is there perhaps a big penalty and a big fine involved, but the idea that you could be responsible for allowing pills to end up on the street where they can be obtained by drug dealers and sold to end users who are preyed upon and are exploited because of their addiction. Education. I think this is a big part of what all of us can do, providing information to people about the dangers of addiction and prevent them from getting started in the first place, some of the risks of opioid use. Drug take-back programs to get the extra drugs out of our medicine cabinets that those teenagers are finding and using. In fact, I know this hospital and this university is very actively engaged with the OPEN program in take-back programs. During Opioid Awareness Week here in Michigan, there is a National Take-Back Day is Saturday, and there will be take-back locations. I know one at St. Francis Church. Maybe there are others here as well. And that's a great thing. And there's lots of resources, again, on that michigan.gov/opioids website. We'll tell you about lots of different collection websites. I know that our locations, I know that this hospital also provides that information. When I go to get my medical care, I see those signs, and that's a great thing to provide education to patients who might be too shy or embarrassed to ask you about it, but when they see that, can take matters into their own hands. There's a video called Chasing the Dragon. When I was at the U.S. Attorney's Office, we showed this video to a lot of community groups at schools, parent organizations, community organizations, Rotary clubs, and the like. It's about a 45-minute film. So we would show the film and then do a discussion, a panel discussion, but you can find it yourself just by going to dea.gov. And it's an interesting narrative that follows the lives of 5 people who became addicted to opioids. So just another tool for teaching. I think contributing to national education campaigns can also be something that we can do. Like there's this one, right? Got milk. There's so many good ways. Or this is your brain on drugs. What's the opioid equivalent, right? Surely someone can come up with a catchy slogan or a way. And as superficial as they may seem, I think there is value in just prompting a conversation. It gets your kids talking about it when they see an ad on television or on a billboard or on social media. And maybe that's the way to reach young people, is catchy slogans on social media or catchy, gifts on social media. That just gets their attention. And as superficial as that may be, it can prompt a conversation about what opioids are, what their proper use is, and how they can be abused and how harmful they can be. Another program that's going on in law enforcement is something called Hope Not Handcuffs. This is started by a program called the Families Against Narcotics. You may be familiar with great organization made up of a lot of people who are parents who lost children to narcotics, and a judge named Linda Davis who had a daughter who had a problem with opioids, and who also sees every day so many people come before her in court whose crimes were driven by some sort of opioid addiction. But the idea is that someone who is struggling with opioids can go to their local police department, and instead of being arrested for using or possessing opioids, they can get connected with help. They go through a program. They have volunteers who come in that they refer to as their angels, who will help someone navigate through the system of finding a treatment center and working through. And one way you can help is there are programs in a number of different counties, but not Washtenaw. We should correct that. There should be a program in Washtenaw County. As part of Michigan Opiate Awareness Week, one of the things announced by the state of Michigan is that Michigan State Police will now participate in this. At every Michigan State Police post, you can go to this. But again, not one in Washtenaw County. Our closest is in Brighton. So I think we have a need for this in Washtenaw County. I will tell you, the Washtenaw County Sheriff's Department is very on top of this issue and has actually hired a recovering addict to be an outreach worker for them, to work with people that they encounter in the system to try to help them, as someone who has more credibility and can relate to patients and be maybe a little less intimidating than sheriff's deputies in dealing with the problem. So that concludes my remarks. I hope that we can talk a little bit more, because I'd love to hear about your thoughts, either your reactions to some of these issues I've raised regarding chronic pain and the laws, or any questions that you might have for me. What can I do for you? Yes, Dr. Oh, thank you. How kind. Dr. Inglesby. Yeah, no doubt. Yeah, I'm not an expert on this. I'm just the messenger.
The laws, like the Got Milk campaign, the laws really made doctors. My question is this: can you give your perspective on legalization of marijuana and how that relates to this problem from the lens of law enforcement?
Yeah, I don't know how it relates to this problem. One thing I can tell you is, regardless of people's opinions, one of the things, if you look at data out of a state like Colorado, where marijuana has been legalized, one of the things that you see is a much higher rate of young people using marijuana, in part because it loses its taboo, and in part because it's much easier to acquire. Older brother, older sister can get it, much in the same way alcohol is now. It becomes much more prevalent. I have also been told that marijuana that is being produced now in places like Colorado is much more potent than people remember from the 1960s and 70s and were using. And so it can be much more harmful to the developing brain. I think that legalized drugs leads to more impaired driving, which can lead to additional. So there are many things that I, as a former law enforcement professional, find distasteful about it. I think that if you started a society from scratch, you would never introduce a substance that makes people dumber, slower, lazier, and poorer drivers. But could it be a healthier substitute for opioids? I don't know, and I think that's a question for medical professionals. I hear NFL players, for example, who get tested positive for marijuana, who say, I'm in horrible, horrible pain. I don't want to use opioids because you told me these are horrible things that will cause me to be addicted. And if I just have a little marijuana, I can relieve my pain. And certainly not others, NFL players aren't the only ones. They've been outspoken, but people, all kinds of people dealing with chronic pain. So I guess that's a question for medical professionals about how harmful it is. I know that DEA still schedules marijuana as a Schedule I drug and thinks of it as very seriously, something that alters brain chemistry. Again, I'm not the medical professional to know about that. So there are many reasons I would say I would oppose it as a law enforcement professional, unless it would be one of those alternative pain therapies that we could use that I have just advocated for in exchange for opioids. I don't know if you have a perspective on it or if others have a perspective on it. I'd be curious. Yeah. Yeah. I don't know. Yes. Yeah, what we in the federal government have access to is Medicare data. At the state level, it may be that they have access to Medicaid data, but we were using Medicare data. What we would often find once we began that, we could use legal process like subpoenas and other things to obtain private, like Blue Cross data to see that as well. But it seems that, again, probably some of this is the crimes that we as federal prosecutors were interested in is where the federal government had been defrauded. And so once we had a case, we would then expand into Blue Cross and other things. But we found a great deal of Medicare data. And part of what drives that is the ability to exploit a vulnerable population. There were patient recruiters who will drive around to homeless shelters and soup kitchens and other places and say, do you have a Medicare card? If the answer is yes, they would say, how would you like to make $100 today? You bet I would, because these are people who are homeless or indigent. They would drive them to the doctor. They would either undergo or sign a piece of paper saying that they had undergone some sort of treatment, and they get their $100. Meanwhile, doctor now bills for $5,000, and in that way, Medicare was defrauded. So I don't really know what the Medicaid fraud picture looks like. And once we had that picture, we would start to subpoena private records. So I don't know that we have the big picture of private insurance records either. And then what can you do about it? I don't know. I don't think you're the doctors who are at issue here. I think, as I said before, it's really the smaller subset of crooked doctors. Probably not anyone in this room, but doctors who've gone bad. And I will tell you that most of those crooked doctors are otherwise respectable doctors with practices. The ones who are at the pill mills, maybe not so much, but they have a license. But the crooked doctors are people who once sat in an auditorium like this and went through lectures like this and saw the money just to be irresistible. $300 million. Who could turn that down? I hope most of us, but some find it irresistible. And first you start giving somebody a test that is maybe necessary, maybe not. I can remember when I was getting physical therapy for plantar fasciitis. Is there a doctor in the house who can help me with that? I've dealt with that for years. I am a slow, plodding runner, but I've dealt with plantar fasciitis for years. And so I've had on and off physical therapy. And I remember the physical therapist constantly wanted to give me this like electrostimulation thing. And I kept telling him, I don't think it's really doing anything for me. And it continued to do it. And later, as I learned more about healthcare fraud, I wondered, was I getting that just because he could bill it, to someone very expensively? And so he was otherwise legitimate, but I wondered how borderline that procedure was. And so there, we don't have the resources to go after the gray area doctors. The ones that we're going after are really the low-hanging fruit. So I think that an honest, honorable doctor who is prescribing consistent with what he perceives his patients need to be, after appropriate counseling and other things, is not the heart of the problem. I think the heart of the problem is those who are greedy and seeking to make money off the backs of their patients. Yeah.
Now that we have maps and prescription drug monitoring systems, is there any reason that law enforcement can't identify the pill mills, within a few months after they open?
I think so, and I hope so. These new laws that were just put in place about, you can't prescribe more than 3 days and 7 days and all that. I'm hopeful that that's going to shut them down in Michigan. What often happens is they just move on to another state where the rules are less stringent. And, for now in Michigan, I say, see ya, on your way. And hopefully at some point all the states will be on board. Some states were ahead of us. Massachusetts and Ohio had similar rules before we did. But, at some point, perhaps all 50 states will have them and we can put them all out of business. But you see that where, healthcare fraud started in Miami. And then once the laws got stringent there, they moved to places like Detroit. And they move around depending on where they perceive there to be vulnerable populations and laws they can exploit. Yes?
I'd like to just follow up. Many of us here do work in large data sets. We identify patterns as we look at socioeconomic differences and identify where we're not providing services in underserved areas, for instance. So we're very used to looking at administrative and billing data. You can't commit fraud without submitting a bill. There is a record that is discernible, identifiable, and auditable in any kind of fraud you can think of that deals with healthcare. So I guess the question is, and John was alluding to, why don't we have more interaction with people that know how to look at clinical data, know how to look at large data, big data sets, and can identify patterns of use and therefore patterns of abuse as they're occurring. I understand the limitation of not having the resources to mount large investigations, and you probably only want to go after the 300 million people. But there's other ways of giving people a heads up that they're under review. You know, putting a police officer with a radar gun on a highway tends to limit the number of people that go 80 miles an hour in a 40-mile-an-hour zone. So giving people a heads up that they are under review, even though they may not have crossed a threshold that requires the DEA and the FBI to get involved, may be a way of keeping that kind of activity at bay.
Yeah, as a deterrent.
Yeah, so that and you know, my guess is we could figure that out in about 3 months worth of billing. It doesn't take long to identify patterns that just don't make clinical sense.
Yeah, you're hired. Yeah. No, I think it's a brilliant idea. I'm not in government anymore, but I would love to connect you with people who do the statistical research to see if there's a way to be more front-end centered. You know, we tended to enforce at the back end for prosecution, but I agree with you that a smarter way to go after the problem wouldn't be to pay and chase, as they say, but to deter at the front end. Maybe we can talk afterwards, and I can get your contact information to connect you with folks that, you know, CMS and HHS, I think, provide regulatory roles, and I don't know to what extent they're already doing some of this, but to the extent that they're not, they should be. I agree with you. It's a great suggestion. Yes. Wow. Yep.
Whether, you know, just to be proactive so that the community who, you know, whether it's family members who know that they have a loved one who is overusing narcotics, to know that this is a really high risk time for them.
That's great to know. You know, when we were taking down other kinds of fraudulent medical providers, we had a cancer doctor, Dr. Fareed Fata in Oakland County, who was lying to patients about having cancer when they did not, so that he could bill Medicare for expensive chemotherapy treatments. I mean, really horrible. But I'll tell you, in that case, we did a very proactive job in advance of making sure we're going to shut him down on a Tuesday, that those patient files were ready to go, because there were real cancer patients there who needed their files to go see another doctor. And I don't think we've done the same thing at all with regard to pill mills. And that's actually makes a lot of sense, doesn't it? Because if you can't get your pills from the place you've been getting it, now where do I go? To the street, and I'm getting heroin, which may be laced with fentanyl. And so maybe that is the most dangerous time to try to get someone some treatment help. Yeah, I'll pass that on to my former colleagues. That's a really good thing to know. And they're well equipped to do it. They're not going to give them an advance heads up, but as soon as it's taken down as part of the takedown plan, there could be some you know, community education that's done around that. Yeah, thank you for that suggestion. Yes.
Briefly mentioned the idea of drug testing in the context of football players, I think, a few minutes ago. As you probably know, drug testing was started under President Reagan, and it's become a giant industry. And I'm just curious if it has any connection or role to what you've been talking about.
And tell me, say more about that. Are you suggesting that it's a driver, or what's your thought
okay. There are federal rules that require some industries to have regular drug testing programs for their employees. This hospital has drug testing facilities for employees when they take on new hires. I don't know if they do random stuff or not, but there's an enormous industry out there, and there's a lot of money changing hands. And I'm just curious, does that have any connection to this? I mean, with all this drug testing, we obviously haven't had a positive impact on opioid overdoses. It's been going in the wrong direction despite the drug testing. So it's sort of
I guess I don't know about that, and I don't know whether the people who are being tested are the people who are using opioids. Maybe the problem would be bigger without testing. I don't know. Certainly in the federal government, we dealt with drug testing. All of the employees at my office were drug tested, including random drug tests. And I suppose the idea there was, you know, when people have sensitive positions in all sectors of of society. You want to make sure that they are of sound mind when they're making decisions or operating heavy equipment and the like. I don't know, to the extent there's a correlation, I would suggest that there's probably less opioid use among those who are being tested. Yes? I don't know. I don't know. Other questions? Yes, sir.
How effective have states been in suing pharmaceutical?
Yeah, how effective have states been in suing pharmaceutical companies? I don't know. When I was at the U.S. Attorney's Office, we had 2 lawsuits against major pharmaceutical companies where there was, evidence that they were supplying kind of middlemen that they had at least good reason to believe were ending up in illicit hands. And we had 2 really large lawsuits with huge numbers of penalties that they paid. And the next day they were right in business, going about their business. I think the money is just so lucrative that I don't know how impactful some of these lawsuits are. But the state of Michigan had one, and the state of Massachusetts had one. Purdue Pharma was the subject of one. I think that one ended up getting reduced to a misdemeanor, though, so I don't know how effective that one was. But I'll tell you, we had one with Mallinckrodt, and another one that's escaping me, who paid, hundreds of millions of dollars. And then, the next day they're back in business. I think the numbers are just so eye-popping that I don't know that, I'm hopeful that it causes them to think twice. I'm hopeful that once they go through that process, just as this hospital did, not only is there the financial cost, but no one wants that stigma. No one wants that professional black eye. I think people want to do things the right way. But the financial inducement is really great there. So I'd like to think it makes some difference. I don't think it has solved the problem.
Thanks for a great talk. Question regarding your role at the U.S. Attorney's Office and the impact on pharma. So we know pharmaceutical companies obviously have been implicated in this epidemic for a long time, and I'm just wondering on your perspective on their evolving role as the stigma of opioid addiction has changed over time, and from a law enforcement standpoint, how much or how little have they been involved in the work that you're doing?
Yeah. So, they have compliance rules as well. They're part of this highly regulated industry. So in addition to settlements that have gone, there's also a lot of this self-governance that we've seen. So, one hopes in an effort to get ahead of the curve and to avoid being the subject of lawsuits, they've been a lot more proactive as well. And so I think we're seeing good changes coming from Big Pharma. Those are complicated businesses. I think they start out in an effort to do good things, but it's also huge money, huge dollars involved. But I think as a result, they don't want to get crosswise with the law. So I think we've seen good change in terms of self-policing in the pharmaceutical industry. Any other questions? All right, well, we are just about at 1 o'clock, so seeing none, I will say thank you so much for inviting me to be here. Appreciate it.